All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our Society for Conservation Biology North America Conservation Education Workshop Series. And today we'll be joined by Dr. Terry Allendorf, and I will give a proper introduction in just a little bit, but thank you so much for joining us today. So if I can get my screen to advance, there we go. So I want to start off with just a quick introduction to who we are at SCBNA. So we are a professional society that is dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. Our vision is a world with thriving biodiversity, ecosystems, and human connections. And our mission is to provide an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers diverse students and professionals to contribute, advance, and apply conservation science. And we can't do all of this and achieve this mission and vision without the support of all of you and of our members of SCBNA. And so we would love to have you join as a member if you are not already. To those of you who are, thank you so much for your support. And members of SCBNA have access to professional development opportunities, research and publications, and biennial conferences. And you can join SCBNA using the QR code on your screen. And maybe Bernie can pop the link in the chat as well, just for ease of access for folks that may not be able to scan the QR code. So I'm going to leave that for a second if anybody wants to scan and join. All right. So this workshop series is being hosted by our education committee at SCBNA. So our education committee advances conservation science and practice through the development of education resources and professional development opportunities. So our education committee serves the interests of educators, students, and members who are interested in advancing conservation science and practice through the development of education resources and professional development opportunities. We have several activities like technical skill building via workshops and online webinars, career development opportunities via panel discussion with experts and mentoring events, and social and networking events as well. I am the Vice President of Education at SCBNA, Dr. Stephanie Clemens, and then we have many wonderful committee members who are listed here on the screen as well, who really help make these programs happen. And I should say, I am brand new to this position. So really everything up to this point has been from this incredible education committee and Bernie as well, who is on the call here too. And we are always welcoming new members to our education committee. And so if you are interested in joining this group, you can email us at education@scbnorthamerica.org. And we would love to have a conversation with you about joining our education committee. And I don't know if we have any of our committee folks on the call today, but if you're here, thank you so much. We are also looking to crowdsource some funding resources. And so, seeking non-US federal opportunities for graduate and postdoc fellowships and assistantships, undergraduate research opportunities, student and professional internships, and small, medium, or large grant opportunities. You can add a listing at the QR code on the top or view the list at the QR code on the bottom. We really want to get these resources out there to folks. And so this is a way that you can kind of help contribute or find resources for yourself as well. I'll leave those up for a second too, in case anybody wants to scan those. Okay. All right. So you are all here today for our Conservation Education Workshop series. So each of our workshops will focus on incorporating practical resources into classroom curricula and/or out-of-school time programs, and will include opportunities for hands-on learning with our workshop facilitators. So we're looking to schedule a few more workshops, hopefully another one in the fall and also in the spring. We have a call out for requests for sorts of workshops that you would like to see or proposals if you would like to lead a workshop yourself. So please let us know if you're interested in either suggesting a workshop or in giving a workshop. And today's webinar, we have Dr. Terry Allendorf doing our workshop today on an introduction to community conservation of global biodiversity. And Dr. Allendorf has worked on issues of local communities and conservation since 1994. She earned her PhD in conservation biology at the University of Minnesota and has substantial experience with conservation policy and community level programs. Currently, she is the executive director of community conservation. Community Conservation Inc. has been catalyzing and supporting community-based organizations since 1989, working with communities in 18 countries, which is pretty incredible. They focus their efforts on rare habitats and endangered species. And so, again, Dr. Allendorf, we are so glad to have you joining us today. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. Um, and that is it. We'll get to the post-event survey at the end. So thank you so much, Dr. Allendorf, and I am going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and happy to see so many people here. And let me see if I'll share my screen before I start talking here. Okay, how is that? Is everyone seeing the full slide there?
Yep, you're good.
Okay, great. So I'm so excited to have this chance. I want to thank let's see if I can get it to go forward. There we go. I want to thank you for being here, and thanks to SCBNA for giving me this chance. I'm very excited to be doing this today. I guess I want to say just first that I've been teaching this in some way, shape, or form for about 5 years as an actual course now at the University of Wisconsin. I've done it as a seminar. We've done some other online workshops over a period of weeks, and also in-person workshops over like 2 days. So you're getting a very concentrated version, and I've tried to leave some things out, but that's always really hard. So there's going to be a lot packed into here. And normally when I can teach it more slowly and over more time, there's a lot more interaction, a lot more interactive activities, even in the online version. But since today we only have the hour and a half, and we weren't sure how the technology would work. Like I have some polls in here, but I think I can't do the polls with you either. So hopefully there's something in here for everyone, and hopefully it'll just help you all think about communities. And I would love all of your feedback in the notes here or later, since there's no polls to be capturing that as we go along. So just to introduce myself a little bit and my background, I started off in Peace Corps in Nepal, which has definitely set me off on this trajectory. So then that's why I put 1994 as the beginning date, because then I started my PhD looking at protected areas and people in Nepal. Went on to do my PhD in conservation biology, looking at those things. Became a AAAS fellow next, and have consulted ever since then until January with USAID, when my last contract, my most recent contract was completely canceled. So we'll see what happens with that side of things. I'm also affiliated with the UW at Madison here. So I've been a board member of community conservation since 2011 and became executive director. So between all these activities, I wear a lot of hats, which has been really great working with communities, right? Because I've worked a lot on the ground on projects. I've been able to go in and do huge biodiversity and forestry assessments for USAID at the country level, and working everywhere in between as an academic too. So putting all those pieces together has just really been a really wonderful way to really think holistically about communities and where they fit into biodiversity conservation globally. So here's a survey that we're not going to be able to do. I wanted to ask you guys where all of you are coming from and your experiences. And so feel free to write anything in the chat if you want, or the notes there. So what I want to do, and hopefully there will be lots of time at the end for questions and other things, so we'll see how this goes. But I have three main things I want to try and cover today, and that is first to give you some community conservation examples, so you can just kind of see where I'm coming from and the experiences, and also see some global examples of why it works. So one of my questions in one of the surveys I was going to ask was, are you already convinced that communities can be a really beneficial thing for conservation of biodiversity at a global scale or not, right? Some people it seems, of course, communities are important. And for other people, it may be kind of hard because you're like, well, communities can do some things and, but can they conserve like large animals, right? Like what's the limits of of community? How can communities really work at this larger landscape scale, right? So there's questions like that. And I hope the examples will help answer some of those questions and situate you a little bit in terms of what the potential for community conservation is. And then we're going to get into some nuts and bolts, like what are some of the principles of community conservation? Why does it work? What does the process look like? And that's based on community conservation's experience over, almost 4 decades or 4 decades now of doing it. And then also the academic research that supports all of it. There's so much out there that actually supports what we're seeing on the ground. And then finally, there's project design, but we're not going to get too much into that today, but that could be a part two. So if people are interested or we want to think about, you designing your own projects, often with the workshops, that's a piece of what I do is help people design their own projects. So I just finished a virtual workshop with some students in Bangladesh, and there's a couple of them that are going off and starting their own projects right now, one with elephants and one with birds and riparian areas. So in the end, this can be very practical and hands-on and can help you get right out into the field and start working with communities. So to start off with some of the examples I wanted to give you, I was going to talk first about the two national level examples, which are like global models for what I think community conservation is, and that's Namibia and Nepal. And I've also written an article about the origin story of those two countries and how community conservation started. So if you search like Allendorf origin story Nepal and Namibia, it'll pop up on an online journal called The Revelator. That gives you some background to those two countries. And then I'm going to show you some examples that we're working on right now with community conservation, some of our partners and projects that we have. And that should give you like a nice feeling for the diversity of what it looks like around the world in a very practical way. And there's just some questions I have on here for you as I'm describing, giving you these case studies, things you can think about, like what role do communities play in the different projects I'm describing? What are the benefits to communities? Like what are you hearing me talk about, or what seems to be their reasons for doing it, for participating? And then maybe based on these examples, how would you define community conservation? Just listening to me tell the stories. So Namibia is one of the most successful because of their community wildlife conservancies, which cover a huge percentage of their land, 20%. They've got 86 wildlife conservancies, and they do overlap with their community forestry, but that's actually relatively small compared to the wildlife conservancies. So the total area under communal management is 22%, which is a significant chunk of the country. And that complements the national parks and state-owned tourism. And this is community conservation is part of a toolbox, right? It complements it. It can help these other tools. So I'm not someone who says, throw away all the other tools. We have to go towards everything has to be community. But I am saying it can complement, and we can also push for some of these more traditional things like national parks to incorporate communities better, right? And to acknowledge their existence and their ability to help co-manage. That would be another form of community conservation. So you've got 40% of Namibia is protected, so it's standing out as like a country that's protecting its biodiversity with the help of communities. And the wildlife numbers in Namibia show the success of community conservation. So elephant numbers have grown tremendously, lions have increased, the black rhino population has increased. And for some of these, they don't publish precise numbers because of poaching issues, right? But the success is there. And then you've got game counts for a whole bunch of other species that have increased and then stabilized. So it is a global model for communities helping to protect wildlife. And of course, there's a lot more I could describe there, but that's just a quick snapshot of how it's successful. And then in Nepal, where I've worked since the early 90s, and that's when community forestry really took off in Nepal. And you can read so much about Nepal and its success. Even the New York Times has covered the success. So in the 1970s, we had predictions that in Nepal and the general Himalayan area, you would lose all the forest by 2000, right? It was sort of like the population bomb. It was sort of the idea that if things continue the way they are, everything is lost. And even the rhinos and tigers, everything's going to disappear by the 1980s. But then they started implementing community forestry. It sort of began in the 70s, got implemented into policy in the 90s, and really took off. And now they have now doubled their forest cover. And that is because of community forestry. They've gone from 26 to 45% forest cover. You've got a third of all the households in Nepal participating, right? You've got over 22,000 community forest user groups. So it's incredible how many people are participating. And they're protecting about 30% of the forests in Nepal. And protected areas areas are about a third, and then the other third is government forest. You've had zero poaching of rhino in the protected areas, I mean, pretty much zero for a few years. There's some other issues, nothing's simple, but basically people are not poaching. Communities are helping to protect the rhinos and tigers from poaching. And the tiger population is one of the few countries that reached WWF's goal to double the tiger population by 2022. So they've been incredibly successful. And I feel very lucky that I began there because I think because I worked in Nepal and saw community forestry taking off, I just realized the power of communities and why they want to participate in conservation. And I also I like showing this because you can see, I mean, I think another thing people think is the more people, the harder conservation is to do. And if you look at this map, which is global population density, so here we have India and Nepal is up here. So here's India, here's Nepal. This is some of the most densely populated areas in the world, and they're doing amazing things with communities. I will make the argument that the more people you have, the easier it is to do conservation. There's more people watching. There's more people on the front lines. There's more people with a vested interest to protect the resources around them. And in a place like Africa, where there's so few people, it can be really hard to protect those large landscapes just through government and guards and rangers, right? So population is just another theme I want to throw in there that is relevant to community conservation, but in no way means that, it's harder just because you have more people. Okay, so and if there's any questions, I don't know, like if things that seem Bernie or Stephanie I should answer, I'm not looking at the comments, but let me know if something kind of pops up. So now just to give you some examples of community conservation, the specific projects on the ground that we've done over the past 40 years. We have had 30 projects in 18 countries. Two of the most well-known and successful projects, which you can look up again, there's lots online if you want to learn more about them, are the Community Baboon Sanctuary in Belize and the Golden Langur Conservation Project in Assam, India. The Community Baboon Sanctuary was CC's very first project, started by Dr. Rob Horwich, who's the founder of CC. He was a primatologist and ethologist, and he went to Belize and realized that, wow, there's this population of black howler monkeys, and they should be protected, and I should start, he's like, I should start working with the local landowners to do it. So that's sort of his moment of realizing how important communities were. These are private lands. These monkeys aren't going to be protected unless the community is involved. So he started working with the community, and we have worked there, supported them for a long time, don't work directly with them now, but still, support them sort of indirectly. But they've been completely successful and sustainable. They had 800 howlers in 1985 that grew to over 4,000 in early 2003. And one of the issues that happens is it's really hard to sustain projects. We all know this, right, over the long term. And for communities too, they can get something sustainable and on the ground, but they have not been able to conduct another real census since 2003 because it is just so hard to get funding for that kind of thing. And they know the numbers aren't decreasing because they're still doing all the same work. They just can't, and they see the monkeys, they just can't get the funding to do a formal survey. The other project I want to mention is the Golden Langur Conservation Project in Assam, India, that began in the 90s. And the particular forest I want to talk about is Kakoijana, which is down here in this area. So the project worked around the whole Manas Biosphere Reserve and in these patches of forest. But there's one really interesting patch of forest called Kakoijana where there's about 30 villages that came together because they wanted to protect the golden langur monkey. In 1994, the canopy cover of the area that the villages was sort of using as forest, but had no kind of tenure or management over, that was only a canopy cover of 5%, and they had less than 100 golden langurs. And our founder actually, a birding group, took him to the forest and said, these villagers, we want to work with them to protect this area. They want the forest back. They want to protect the langur. And Rob, our founder, said, nope, forget it. The forest is gone. The monkeys are living on the ground. This is hopeless. And they stuck with it anyway. And by 2012, the canopy cover was more than 80%, and they had more than 500 golden langurs. And again, it's been a completely successful project. So successful that the state government keeps trying to take it over and claim it as like a national park and take it away from the local community. So these are some of the issues, like, there's never an end to conservation, as we know, right? So whether it's communities doing it, it's more sustainable, it's on the ground, they can be the front line, but they're facing all the same things we are as conservationists at any scale, right? The funding, long-term support, money to do the research, right? So all those issues stay the same for communities also. And just to touch on some of our current projects, most of the countries we work in, we work through local partners who we've worked with, like our founder had worked with, or they do similar work to ours. So in Peru, for example, we work with Neotropical Primate Conservation. Our founder started working with them in 2009 and 11. They did some big workshops, and they create locally run protected areas or conservation concessions, which is the official policy that best allows a community to get some kind of tenure over the land in order to protect it. So an interesting thing to think about in all these places is what policies actually support a community to do conservation. And Peru has a lot of indigenous peoples policies. They are not the policies that best help the community to actually protect an area for biodiversity. So our partner uses the conservation concession policies to do that, and they've got 4 new ones in the works. I mean, they're always forming new ones, and so they've created 11. They're forming some new ones, and that's just a rotating thing. And they keep doing as many as they can because communities have a need. They want to be doing it, and a lot of it is paperwork and trying to get it registered with the government. In the case of Peru, here's just a video of one of those 16 farmers that live around this site called Yantalo, this hill, and the farmers are trying to protect it. And they just got it signed this last year to become a conservation concession. They protect the endangered San Martin titi monkey in that area, as long as a bunch of other species. And I wanted you to kind of hear a little bit from our partners. So I do have some videos in here, so it's not just me talking at you. And I hope you can hear this.
Terry, it's hard to hear. When you shared your screen, did you check the little box that says share sound?
Oh, I may not have this time. I think I
That's
did the
okay.
first
So if you
time.
just stop share and then reshare and make sure you check that little box, and then we should be able to hear it.
Okay, let me get back to you guys. Too many things. I just stop sharing over here, and then I go back to share, click the box. Okay, let me know. Here we go.
Desde el 2009 decidí venir
Great, thank
a
you.
vivir aquí a los bosques de montaña. Cuando venía aquí comencé a trabajar haciendo conservación, haciendo investigación, ayudando y apoyando comunidades locales y me gustó mucho el trabajo. Entonces decidí quedarme. Ya llevo aquí alrededor de 13, 14 años trabajando en NPC. Inicialmente fui voluntario los primeros 5 años, hacía trabajo voluntario. Después decidimos fundar NPC Perú desde el 2013-14, y estoy liderando el proyecto de conservación. Y pues estamos conduciendo varios proyectos aquí en Perú, ¿no? El principal es el de conservación comunitaria. Trabajamos con comunidades locales para crear áreas de conservación que son administrados por ellos mismos y nosotros les brindamos todo el apoyo, el soporte, todo el proceso, acompañamos en todo el proceso de creación, pero además también realizamos investigación científica que después traducimos en información científica, principalmente primates, pero también de otras especies animales. Anfibios, reptiles, aves, mamíferos en general. Toda esa información la convertimos en material útil, ¿no? Para darle a conocer a la gente, para que pueda tener una identidad, para que se pueda sentir la gente orgullosa de la diversidad biológica que tienen en cada una de sus áreas, y de esa manera también puedan comenzar a trabajar conservándolo de una manera sostenible, respetando estos espacios que ellos tienen. ¿Por qué trabajamos con comunidades? Muchos profesionales, lo que nosotros hemos observado es que muchos profesionales vienen, por ejemplo, a hacer trabajos de investigación, a hacer tesis de pregrado, de maestría, de doctorados, pero pasan un tiempo aquí trabajando y después se van. Publican la información es útil, pero muchas veces esa información no vuelve a estos lugares. Y al final quienes viven aquí y quienes siempre van a vivir aquí es la gente local. Y van a tener sus hijos, y sus hijos seguramente van a quedarse también, algunos de ellos, otros quizás no. Entonces, la idea es que la gente que va a cuidar, que va a convivir con estos espacios, con estos hábitats, es la gente que vive aquí. Entonces ellos tienen que tomar el poder, tienen que tomar la responsabilidad de cuidar estas áreas.
Hey, and that was Nestor Algas. I don't know if you missed it at the beginning because I was talking and everything. Who is their program director? And well, actually, their executive director now. Um, so let's see. Sorry that I kind of blipped it out. Every time I do something in Zoom, it stops the video, I guess. So I can't be doing anything on the side, I realized. I can't be looking at comments or anything. Okay, so we're going to move from Peru, that was into Cameroon. We're going to go hit Africa now. Um, we work with Community-Based Biosynergy Management, which is a relatively new NGO founded by Dennis Ndelo, who actually is the wildlife biologist for the Nunavut up in Canada. Funnily enough, there's a large Cameroonian population up there, and he's their wildlife biologist. But he's also continuing to try and work at home. And he's been working in conservation in Cameroon for a long time, had worked with our founder there starting about 15 years ago now, I think. And in Cameroon, what they've seen is they have community forestry. Here's a workshop, a photo of a workshop we did about 3 years ago, the first in 2022, when he was trying to bring together a bunch of stakeholders in Yaoundé and community forest leaders, because what seemed to be happening was the emphasis, on timber and money in community forestry was not going the direction that a lot of communities wanted. And so Dennis had the idea to have this workshop to talk about what do communities want out of community forestry? What can we learn about what the issues are right now? And this is interesting because this is part of one of the ways the model that community conservation can work is trying to hold large, high-level meetings, and we'll hear a little bit more about this later, to let people know that there's interest and that community work is important. And if communities want help to do things, they can come and ask for it. And there are people there that can help them organize and do it. And that's what happened here at this meeting. We had some community leaders who then Dennis was able to start projects with. And here's one. This is Sommier. And this is an area where in Cameroon, they don't even think of doing community forestry because there's no high value timber. And that's just not the way they think about forestry there, the community forestry. But this is the chief here in white talking to Dennis. And there are chimps in these forests that are quickly becoming degraded on the border with Nigeria in an area where Dennis said primatologists didn't even know they were chimps, right? So how important is this group? How are they linked to the larger population? Is this an important site across a landscape? Who knows? But this community said these chimps are declining. We want to help protect the chimps and we want to protect our forests. So Dennis has been working there since 2022 now, trying to help them do that. Sorry, and went too fast there, trying to get the forest registered. But here again, the whole tenure issue is critical because the policy exists, but trying to get it actually registered is half the battle, along with working with the community to help them understand what community forestry is and what the policy in terms of governance and setting up committees looks like. So the governance piece, you got the policy and the governance piece that are really important. And then another site is a very famous community forest in the area down in the southeast that a lot of papers have been published on in terms of it is a community forestry site. The community is doing amazing things. But the forest leader here who was drawing this little map on the ground, what he's telling Dennis is, yeah, we got the forest. We've had it for a while. We got great help with it, but it's too small. So we can protect the forest inside of it, but we also are doing our traditional hunting. As Baka people, they rely very heavily on hunting. And he said it's not sustainable. We know it's not sustainable on this size. And we can't just go back to the way we always used to hunt. So can you help us figure out how to do sustainable wildlife hunting? So here's a case where they don't need the tenure. They don't need us to help register it or get that, any kind of formal thing over it in that way. What they need is technical help. How do we actually manage to hunt sustainably in the area that we have? And maybe try to expand the area we have if we can. So now we're going to move on to Thailand, which was a university. How did I get rid of? Oh no, actually, we're moving on to Myanmar. Sorry. I don't have the pin is in a funny spot there. This is Myanmar. I can't see my title up there because the Zoom thing is blocking it. Okay, this is Myanmar, and in Myanmar, where I've worked actually since 1999 with the Smithsonian, and now we're working through community conservation with them. We have kind of a different model here because our partner is Friends of Wildlife, and they have worked across a lot of different protected areas, writing the management plans for the government and working with, and since I've worked with them since 99 in Chatin Wildlife Sanctuary, this group is really focused on making sure they get the attitudes and perceptions of the communities in the buffer zone. So for these management plans, even though there's nothing official that the government has to help communities in terms of policy, they're doing a lot of work to make sure we understand what the local communities think. And that means they come into contact with the local champions and leaders around all these protected areas. So what we've done there is we bring people in, as this is Umia, who's the founder. He loves these phrases, 0 to hero in biodiversity conservation. So biodiversity heroes training, that's where he's built this center that is a biodiversity heroes training center up in Indaji, which is a biosphere reserve area. And we bring in people from all of those protected areas that have been interested in learning more and designing community conservation projects in their own communities. So village leaders or just champions of conservation at the village level. So we brought them in from 15 different protected areas. I think we had 3 or 4, but then with the political situation, of course, this gets shut down and doesn't happen. And so hopefully the communities, we've left enough of the communities that they can continue doing things. But now Friends of Wildlife is still trying to maintain a relationship up with the Naga in the northern area, who after one of these trainings at this training center said, can you come up and help us protect wetlands in the Naga area of northwest Myanmar? So they've been trying through the political conflict now to keep supporting them, even if it's just by phone calls, because this community is really committed. And so that's kind of another theme, is that every country there can be so much volatility in terms of the politics, and there's no projects going on in Burma now, really. A lot of the the bingos can't work there officially, and so not much is happening. But some of these communities are really trying to keep going, right? The ones who have had and can get some support are really working hard. Here's just a photo of one of the trainings, and they do have community forestry in Myanmar, but it's about 30 or 40 years behind Nepal in terms of its trajectory and the forest department accepting it. So they don't really want to register forest. Friends of Wildlife has really struggled to get the government officials to register things as community forestry in buffer zones of some of these protected areas. So it's been a struggle there in terms of the policies. Actually, I mean, the policies are there, but implementing them is not easy. And here is a video from Kain Sui, who's the current director and a school teacher. When I first started working with her in 1999, she helped us do some of the original surveys when we started talking about people in protected areas, and has gone on to become the director of the NGO.
Hi, I'm Kain Sui from Friends of Wildlife Myanmar. We have had 3 biodiversity hero trainings in Myanmar to promote the local community's capacity to get the collaboration and participation for biodiversity conservation. Regarding the training, the topic will cover organizational development, natural resource management, how important is the community conservation, how to establish the community forestry, and proposal writing for their sustainability. All of the participants who attend the training, they all are representative of the villages. They live around the protected areas. We invited 79 participants from 15 different protected areas for last 3 trainings. They are very happy and active learning in the training. After training, there are changes. Some people, for example, 2 participants from ARE region who attend the past 3 training. They have knowledge sharing by themselves to of their village, what they learn from the training. Some are start doing some activities in the village, such as greening and cleaning. Some are more practical. One participant from Energy, he is very active and very motivated in the village. He is a leader of village conservation group. After training, he negotiated with the Energy Wildlife Sanctuary warden. He get the suggestion idea from the warden, and he collaborated with the FFI Myanmar program, and he started working for the conservation activities in his villages. This training is very good for our people. At least they know how to start a good organization, to manage well-functioning organization, and how important is the biodiversity conservation. We are very thanks to community conservation for fund supporting this training and community pilot project as well. Thank you.
And the work in Myanmar has been interesting because you can still see me and hear me, right? Work in Myanmar has been interesting because from the very beginning, they were focusing on the idea of CSO, the civil society organizations, and Umiao and Friends of Wildlife really, really talks about what is an organization, what is democracy, what is governance, because in the Myanmar context, he was saying at the village level, they don't know how to organize themselves, right? They've been organized from the top down for so long. And so that's just such a critical piece, which is community conservation in Nepal, for example, has really contributed to democracy and what's been happening in Nepal for the last 20 years. Community forestry has been a stronghold of democracy and village level decision making, even during their civil conflict. And so if Myanmar had been farther along in their community forestry, it might have, been a very helpful thing during some of the turmoil they're going through. Let's see. So the next one, this is Thailand. Now we're in Thailand, and Thailand is an interesting example of we're trying to work in a protected area in Tung Yai National Park East and West, which is the Western Forest Complex. It's the University of Minnesota project, and we're more advising on it and working with an NGO, a couple of NGOs, Soup Foundation and Rabbit of the Moon. And the problem with this area is that the communities live inside of the protected area, the traditional Korean communities, and they cannot be resettled under policies, right? You can't really resettle people anymore outside of protected areas. So they sort of have a boundary and they have some land in their fields inside the protected area. And there's absolutely no mechanism for them to actually be able to co-manage or govern or make any management decisions. So in this case, the government's goal is really just to have a better relationship with the communities. So the communities aren't poaching and breaking rules, right? And so figuring out in this context, what can you do to really help the villagers become interested in the conservation, have an avenue for doing it. And actually they are very interested. So Rabbit in the Moon has been doing lots of just basic biodiversity knowledge with the youth, which is 18 through 35 years old. And they're all learning so many different things. They've got their fish expert now and their bird expert. So because there's no policy and no way to organize at that level for the community, they're really just building their biodiversity knowledge and capacity so they can begin to do their own research in their own areas and their own villages and see what's happening around them and hopefully begin to advocate for themselves and their ability to participate and have the government trust them to help with the conservation. So we've been doing camera trapping. One thing that was interesting here when I talked to the community was how interested they were in seeing examples from like Cameroon and some of the other countries, right? Like the power of the community learning what's happening with the other communities around the world. And what was interesting maybe for them is that they cannot hunt legally, right, in the forest because it's a protected area. But in Cameroon, this is I was showing them a video of our Cameroon project. In Cameroon, the Baka, for example, can legally hunt, right? So the Thai people were very concerned, like the forestry people. You should not mention that there's legal hunting in Cameroon. This will be very problematic if you start talking about hunting. But the other interesting thing here is that we were there trying to do tiger conservation. So the point of the project is actually to get people involved in thinking about. So this is Dave Smith, who's a tiger expert who's worked in Asia. He was my advisor actually at Minnesota. He's the one who brought me on to help with this project. And so he knows everything you can know about tigers in this area. And they can see there's no tigers around those villages inside the park, right? There's a buffer around the villages, which is national park, but the tigers are not coming in. And if you could get tigers to use that part of the park, you could really expand the tiger population in the area. So, and they don't really know why there aren't tigers there. Is it a lack of prey? Is it disturbance by people? But he wanted to start working with the communities to try and figure it out. And we haven't actually figured it out exactly. But one thing that was interesting was, again, the partner was like, don't talk about tiger. Do not talk about tiger. The community will get upset. They'll get angry at us if we talk about tiger. But Dave Smith was introduced to the community as a tiger expert. So at the end of like one of the first nights when we were meeting with communities, the community said, but wait a minute, he's a tiger expert. You didn't let him talk about tiger. We want to learn about tiger. Tell us. We're very interested. So the next night, the next village, he did a presentation on tiger, and people were just so interested in the behavior and the changes in the tiger population and what was happening. And again, just giving people access to information and knowledge is so important, right? And here's the NGO partner saying, no, don't talk about tiger because you'll just create conflict. And actually, they hardly lose anything to tiger in this area. It's not a huge conflict species for them in terms of livestock. It's actually pretty low conflict rate compared to a place like Nepal. So just another interesting permutation of a project. Okay, I think this is the last site I'm going to talk about today, is Malaysia. And this was another Smithsonian project that a student from University of Wisconsin had been working on up in Borneo, in Lanjak and Tamal Wildlife Sanctuary. And she'd been doing camera trapping in the wildlife sanctuary for her master's, kind of a traditional camera trapping. Where are the wildlife? How are they being impacted by different forces? And she wanted to turn that into some kind of community project because they've been using the community people as like day laborers, the people who would go out and check the cameras and take them on the trails, and they were paying them to sort of help, but they weren't actually building the capacity of the community in any way, shape, or form, or really sharing the data with them. So she invited me right before COVID to go and say, hey, let's start transforming this program into a community program. And one of the first things we did was just share her videos and her data, which she had never done with the whole community. The men who'd helped had knew something, right? But the children and the women and a lot of the other men had no idea what was really happening in her project. So just sharing that basic information was the first step. We did a quick training for like camera trapping with women because they had never been invited to learn anything about the camera trapping, even though the men had been. They were very excited by that. And then, of course, when we did it with the women, the children come along and they're watching, they're learning also. And so now they're trying to turn that into an overall community project of restoring rubberwood forests inside the community area. And it's a case where it's really unclear what management policies help people actually protect their forests, right? Because they're indigenous people, they have like a traditional recognized tenure area, but there's no real management that they're allowed to do. It's not a clear structure for what we should be supporting them to do other than building their capacity to do their own monitoring and trying to transform some of these rubber wood forests. So that's an interesting project also. Oh, sorry, one more, and that's Nepal. So in Nepal, even though the community forestry is so amazing, what's missing is wildlife in these community forests. As people are not, they're focused on forests, they're not focused on wildlife. And so we are trying to, in this southeast area of Nepal, which people have not really focused on wildlife very much in this area, or actually in the mid-hills very much, but trying to build a wildlife corridor from Manas, the Golden Langur area that I talked about over here in India, all the way to Chitwan National Park in Nepal, right? That would be the dream vision. And this was our founder who thought kind of a 50-year vision, maybe you could have a whole corridor along here. And so we've been working for about 10 years in the corridor just on the Nepal side, trying to work with the local community forests in this first set of hills in Nepal to integrate wildlife conservation into their community forest plans. And so we've been doing a lot of camera trapping again, just trying to raise their interest, let them see the species like pangolin that they don't get to see all the time, just sort of seeing what is in each of the forests. And what was interesting is as we were doing this, and then we compiled videos of like all the animals that each forest had so they could see what was in their forest. And one thing that came out is they said, this is great. Of course, we want to learn how to conserve wildlife. I mean, of course, we want our forests to be healthy and we don't want species to disappear. But they said there's poaching in our forests and we can't stop the poachers, and they're our own village people, right? Like maybe the community forest user group, here's a community forest user group president, maybe it's his brother that's doing the poaching, and they tell the police, they may get arrested, they go in jail for a night, but there's the poachers are selling the meat to the local police and the local government, right? So there's a local corruption that's going on. They just release the poacher the next day. So what the community said is, we want to do this, but the real thing we need is to stop the poaching and get the government to help us to do that. So we created these community-based anti-poaching units out in the far east for this project. It's just sort of in the initial stages, and using this as a way for the community to raise the issues with the government and the other and the other NGOs in the area to get support to stop the poachers and sort of just raise awareness around it. So that was sort of an interesting permutation that they drove in terms of what the threats are. And no one's really talking about low-level poaching like of deer in Nepal. You cannot find any articles. People just don't talk about it and aren't recognizing it. So it's kind of a difficult issue to tackle. So those are the examples I wanted to go through, hopefully a diversity of things. And we'll pause here. And for any questions anyone has. And there was going to be a survey, but we won't do it. So if you have any questions or anything you want to put in here into the chat or raise your hand or however works best. Anything I can clarify? Or anything confusing? What was your favorite example? Someone tell me their favorite example or most surprising or something you didn't believe maybe. Okay, I'm saying, can you say a little bit more? A little bit more about the Belize Community Project for howlers. Okay, so the Belize Community Project, there's a lot I could say about that since it's a long project. I think one of the most interesting things is they did really try to incorporate so much into that project. They're conserving howlers, and then they created an NGO, And back in the 90s, it could have been a real model, or maybe the 2000s, a real model for community conservation across Belize. It could have become sort of like a Nepal thing, I think. But some large environmental NGOs didn't really think that was the direction to go. And so what you see is the community conservation policies, from my understanding, I'm not an expert on Belize, but kind of fell away in favor of more like NGOs being the managers of protected areas rather than communities. And so that's the focus there. But in our project, the one we were working on, that group about 1999, the men decided they were a little tired. Maybe they had other things they wanted to be doing. And the women actually ended up taking it over. And it is a highly regarded, well awarded globally program of women's conservation at this point with Jessie. Oh my God, sorry, there's too many names in my head right now. So Jessie is now the wife of the person who initially helped set it up with Rob. She's taken it over. And again, they're facing the same problems. They're doing this amazing job keeping it going. They have education. They've got so many activities that they're doing that are around it with schools and the kids and some livelihood things that have been kind of hard to get off the ground and not enough funding, of course, but winning many awards. But they have just kept it going, right? So they're, I think, a case study on their whole history and all the ups and downs and all the variables would be really interesting. I think the next one I see is let's see.
So
I'd love to know how
Hillary, yeah.
oh,
Is
go
it
ahead, go
helpful
ahead.
if I read them out for you, Terry?
Sure, yeah, that just break it
Okay.
up for me a little bit. Yeah, that'd be
Sure,
good.
yeah. So Hillary was asking, I'd love to know how most of these initiatives and partnerships begin, which I think is a great
Yeah.
question.
And in our case, it's because we're a founder organization, just thinking about us. A lot of times it was our founder either meeting someone at a meeting doing community-based work that he thought he could really help contribute to, and making a partnership and saying, hey, I can come help. Like NPC in Peru, he's the one he went and they thought they were kind of doing it fine. But when he went, he said, let's have this big meeting. Let's pull in a lot of people at a larger scale and have a meeting and say that you're here and you want to work with them. And Rob did this in a bunch of places. And what our Peru partner found is that years later, those big meetings are still paying dividends in terms of people still keep coming to them, right? They kind of got a reputation like, yes, they're there and they will help people. So then, and we'll hear more about, like I said, we'll hear more about that later, how that has really helped them, having people come to them instead of them looking for communities, right? Because you don't really need to look for communities. If they know you're there, they'll come to you and ask for help. And the other way it happens, Rob, in terms of historically, in terms of our program, he would find a species that he thought needed help that maybe someone wasn't working on, and he would try and find a local partner to go work with and build their capacity. So in India, for example, he was brought in as a consultant for a fish and wildlife program, and then met some of these more local groups and started working and collaborating with them, and that's how the Golden Langur project took off, as sort of a smaller sub project of what they were trying to achieve. And so I think every case is a little different. And I think the main thing is there's so much potential, so many communities out there that want help to do things. And these projects can start in different ways. Someone going out as a researcher and saying, hey, let's work together, or a community, if they know they have someone they can go to, saying, hey, come help us. We need help getting this done, whether it's registration or technical capacity or, monitoring or governance or whatever it is. So yeah, there's just a whole bunch of different ways these things begin. Sorry, go ahead. I'll let you do it.
No, it's okay. I saw that Meg said the tigers, and I think that's in reference to the thing that was most surprising about not talking about them. And then Meg asked, are y'all able to still work in Myanmar with all the political conflict that's going on?
Yeah, so no one is really directly working there. We're all the groups are indirectly, but Friends of Wildlife is, a Myanmar group. So they are struggling on to do what they can with very little funding because it's hard to get funding into the country. And then they literally can't travel because roads are dangerous, right? So they did manage to get up to like the Naga area where they can't bring people into that training center at this point. They did make last year, they were able to get up into the Naga area and do a training with them, but they had to wait until they heard that there were no bombs on the road and they wouldn't get stopped by one or another of the militias or the government. And they just haven't been able to get out again. So it's all phone calls at this point, saying they get phone call and then they try to give advice over the phone and provide technical help. And so, yeah, that's been really difficult. The tigers, yeah, talking more about the tigers and how they weren't supposed to talk about them. And I think this is a real example of how anyone who's an outsider, it doesn't matter if it's like someone from another country or someone from the capital or a large NGO in a country, we go into the communities with our own set of biases and assumptions, right? And for whatever reason in Thailand, they're really worried that they're going to create problems as an NGO if they talk about tiger. Right, and there has been a lot of conflict between the government and these communities, so they have to be quite sensitive what to talk about and how to talk about it, right? So that people, I went on a previous trip where the community got really angry about something, and of course, it was never quite translated for us what exactly happened, but there's tensions there because these communities are really hemmed in by the government and what they can and cannot do. And then, so in the case of the tiger, the NGO is thinking, well, this is really going to set the community off, and we don't want them to think we're trying to increase tiger and increase the problems they're having. And yet, that's what the community wanted to know. They want to know about the tiger. They want to know where it's at. And it was not a sense of they were afraid of the tiger. It was just, you said this guy's a tiger expert. This man has worked, Dave is now 80 years old, and he's been going into the field in Asia since he was like 25. He worked at Chitwan under the Tiger Ecology Project for Smithsonian. So he is a fount of knowledge. He is an elder. And they looked at him and they just wanted to learn, and it was that simple. They just wanted to learn about tiger, and they really enjoyed it. And that's, I think, a good lesson for all of us. We're all outsiders, whether you're from the capital or you're from another city than the community, but we all have access to knowledge and information that somebody's going to be really interested in the community. And that's one of the first steps in community conservation, I think, is just us as like the experts or the conservationists or the people with access sharing that and recognizing that they want to learn too, right? Like we shouldn't just keep the knowledge and keep it from them because they might be afraid or not want to work with us or something, but treat them as like partners and collaborators. But yeah, we'll get into that. That's the next part of this, but yeah. And then I see one from Heather.
Yeah, I think Heather's was a comment about one of the parts that they found the most interesting, which is the population map and the connection to conservation success. So I don't know if there's anything you want to elaborate on with that.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear you like that because I throw it in there and I don't often get feedback on it, but I think it's really interesting to think about. And it's going to come up again, I think, later in the presentation when I talk about, I think, differences between the continents, between Africa and Asia. I've done a paper that drew out, and I think it sort of shows some interesting things that kind of relate to that population issue. Yeah. And so I think, again, it's like, the more people you have, maybe the easier it is to do conservation, right? From one perspective, right? The issues may be tougher, right? Like in Nepal, you've got a lot of human wildlife conflicts because you got a lot of people and a lot of wildlife. So it's dense. There's a lot going on, but you also have, this is interesting, actually. Here's a good example. So I just was able to do a contract in Bangladesh last year. That was for USAID. That was the first time I'd been in. And then I've now been doing this workshop with the communities, with the researchers to work with the communities. But the one thing I learned during that USAID review was that someone told me Bangladesh is renowned for social media messages just flying like lightning and having an impact in like the health sphere. They've done some incredible development work and in health work because of the density of people, because word travels really fast through the media, through the villages. Like you cannot stop information from flowing there. And so if we applied that to conservation, right, in terms of Bangladesh, they think what they could achieve. And so again, densities of populations can have some really positive things for us, right? As conservationists, it's not all bad. People are not all bad. So yeah, anything about that before we move on? Here's our survey tool. Not going to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, Heather just added, I took note of the map to share with my colleagues. As conservation biologists, many of us grew up with area-based conservation that often keeps people out. So this shows a different side of conservation. Thanks, Terry, which I think is a great comment. So I think we're ready to move on when you are.
Great. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so now we're moving on to some principles, okay, and sort of the backbone, like why do these cases work? Why did Namibia work? Why does Nepal work? Why have we found so much success? And basically, it's because communities can be good conservationists and to be academic-y and research oriented. There's tons of papers that'll show this, right? It's different contexts. It can get complicated. Depends on how remote the area is. If there's actually any communities there who want to protect it, right? So it gets complicated fast. But the research in general shows that community managed areas are as effective or even more effective than protected areas, right? So that's not the problem. And that, like I mentioned before, if we combine them, I'm not saying one or the other, right? There's no dichotomy here, right? It's all tools in the toolbox need to be considered. And I think you want to combine all the tools we have And then you also want to push the boundaries to have communities as involved as they would like to be, right? Because they are your constituencies in any of these areas too. So even if it is a protected area, the people living around it are the ones you need on to be helping you with conservation. So providing opportunities, knowledge, I mean, that's all to the good. And then if we do this, we will actually reach our global targets, right? I mean, 30 by 30 wouldn't be a problem if we acknowledge like indigenous peoples' land tenure rights in a true way, probably, right? There's papers on this. There's a lot to read here. Uh, but I just want to say community conservation is not a small scale thing, right? That's the examples that Nepal and Namibia tell us. It can be a large national level thing that can help us across the landscape. And this is just a new paper that came out showing critical natural assets and where they're at. And I mean, you know, biodiversity is all around us. We don't just want to be thinking about the critical biodiversity areas, right? Everyone needs biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so this model can work across a range of areas and improve the life and livelihoods and quality of life and health of all of us. Okay, so what is community conservation? I mean, what role can and should communities play in conservation is the first thing I'm going to talk about under this principle, so that make sure we're all on the same page about what it actually is, because I think there's a lot of different meanings for people when they say community conservation. And then we're going to talk about the motivations, or often it's couched as benefits. Like why, you know, what benefits do people get from conservation? Why are they motivated? Do they need to be convinced to do conservation? And then finally, we're going to talk about community heterogeneity and diversity, because I do not mean to imply in any way, shape, or form that like everyone in the community supports biodiversity or conservation in the same way, right? So this is a really critical piece to understand too. So first, what is community conservation? And there's so many terms, right? Community-based conservation, community-led, community-managed, community-based, and they don't really mean anything. We all use them interchangeably, I think, right? I tend to use the simplest, community conservation. But so many people, there's not a conservation project out there that doesn't say it involves the community somehow at this point. But do they really, right? They may be conducting activities with them and it may contribute to conservation, but are they really community conservation projects? And again, you know, if you look at the literature that's tried to look at community conservation and what all these different terms mean and how it's used in projects, there's a couple of papers that do a nice job of sort of setting up a typology, and here's one of them from Nielsen et al. And he talks about, you know, the community conservation approaches they saw were ones that provide economic benefits from conservation linked livelihoods, right? Like butterfly farmers or tourism. So you're trying to provide economic benefits to communities so that they will allow the area to be conserved, right? Or won't try and destroy it. They'll have economic incentives to protect the area. Another way is to provide rewards for changing behaviors or incentives for people to do conservation. So alternative energy like fuel efficient stoves, if they follow the forest laws, they have a fuel efficient stove, they shouldn't need to cut down as much fuel wood. So they're changing their behavior in a way that will help conservation. Maybe direct payments for turtle eggs hatching, right? I'm sure you can all think of different examples that fit into providing rewards or incentives. And then the third type is a community managing natural resources, habitats, or species. So monitoring and enforcing a set of rules, and usually this is some form of tenure, like I've been talking about, community forestry, community wildlife concessions. And at this point, I think I was going to ask you which one you think community conservation is. I don't know if people just want to start putting numbers in the text box, put 1, 2, or 3, or whichever. Which one of those do you think would be community conservation under the way I've been talking about it today? Or which would you count? Which do you think should be? I see a 3, 1 and 3, 3, 3, 3. I'm glad someone said 1 and 3. So yeah, basically I would argue 3, right? I would argue 3. If the community's not doing the conservation, it's not community conservation, right? It's a community adjacent. We've got a 2, 3, but such communities can use 1 or 2. Yes, and exactly right. 3 is community conservation. It doesn't mean that these can't play some kind of a role in it, right? But they're not really community conservation. So, yeah, I'm not trying to say that those things aren't important, but they're not really what conservation is. So community conservation, and because it's conservation, so it means that someone has to be managing and protecting a natural resource, habitat, or species, right? And that just means monitoring. There has to be some way of protecting an area or species. There has to be rules, someone has to be monitoring, someone has to actually be sanctioning. And that's what like community forestry does, right? That's what a concession does. So there can be policies that support that at a country level, right? But communities can do it without formal policies, right? They can also just be protecting. There's lots of examples of communities just doing it anyway without a policy helping them or allowing them to do it. And then the economic benefits are the outcomes often, right? If we protect, I mean, in theory, we're afraid of biodiversity loss and losing our forests and trees and climate change because we think we're going to lose our lives, right? We're going to lose the ecosystem services that is produced by the biodiversity and functioning ecosystems and all those species. So if we do that well, and this happens at a community level too, the farmers know where their water comes from for their fields, right? They know how erosion is controlled, right? So all the work, and I'll get into this more, people know that those are livelihood things come out of conserving your environment, right? And rewards can be integrated into that. But I would say, again, the community should be driving it. They should be the ones figuring out livelihood benefits. They should be the ones figuring out, what kinds of things do they need to provide incentives for different groups in their community, right? And this is just to show kind of in a flowchart way, if your brain thinks more like this. I just pulled this from someone's website because it was so nice and simple. But they're talking about women's involvement, which I'm going to hit on in here, but a lot of my work is on women's involvement in conservation. I'm not going to cover it too much in here, but their chain happens to talk about why women should be involved. If you have women involved, you get improved forest governance, which should increase your forest cover, like in Nepal, right? Which enhances your biodiversity, which improves your livelihood, right? And there's a lot of different ways that this works, but here's livelihood at the end. And often when you look at a lot of people's like theory of change, if you're familiar with conservation planning and theories of change, we talk about livelihood up here. Improve women's livelihoods. Sorry, I hit the wrong thing. Improve their livelihoods, and then they'll be less likely to extract from the forest, right? You can see how the logic is quite different. You're just trying to remove people from an area. You're trying to get them to not go, to not be, using or dependent on an area, rather than putting in some positive things that actually help them participate and do the conservation themselves. Okay, any questions on that, on what is community conservation before I go on to the next thing? Feel free to put anything in the chat at any time. So the community motivations are really what the core of my research has all been about. That's what I did my PhD dissertation on. That's what I went to Myanmar to work with them in 1999. And I've done this, looked at people's attitudes and perceptions of biodiversity and protected areas in a lot of different contexts, Nepal, China, Myanmar, looked at non-protected forests, protected areas, motivations of different groups doing conservation. What motivates them? Why are they doing it? And all I can tell you is that it gives me more hope than anything. Knowing this stuff is what makes me think that we can do so much, right? And I want to do two things. I'm going to show you one case study, which is a summary. I did a summary paper of 132 protected areas around the world and people's local communities' attitudes towards them. And then a case study, just so you can see one particular area and what people's attitudes and perceptions were. So this is how I'm defining people's motivations. Like, what value do people see in protected areas, for example? What, do they like or dislike protected areas in this case? And protected areas are kind of a proxy for the most severe form of conservation, right? Fines and fences, national parks, wildlife reserves, places people cannot enter, places they're resettled from, right? So this should be the most negative relationship full of conflict. So I went through and found every paper I could and published it in 2020 and then 2022, looking at these papers and summarizing what they found across all these 83 case studies and 132 protected areas, all around the world. Not really. A few in Europe, none in North. We don't ask people in North America why they like or dislike Yellowstone National Park, I guess. So that's another question to think about. But and what I found was attitudes of local communities are amazingly positive. If you ask someone if they like or dislike a protected area who lives around it in any of these areas, they are really likely to say they like it. So here in more than this year's number of cases on this side. So if most of the areas, the vast majority of people are positive towards it. So in 28% of the cases I looked at, 51 to 75% of the people who were interviewed said they liked the protected area. In more than half of the cases, More than 76% of the people interviewed said they like it. Okay. And attitude, what's the meaning of attitude, right? Does that really mean anything? So I do want to say that we all know, I hope, attitudes and perceptions do not make for behavior, right? There's a whole bunch of other things that have to happen before people can actively contribute to conservation, right? We've talked about tenure, having knowledge, there's all sorts of things, but the attitude is predominantly positive. People like them. Why do they like them? Why do they say they like them? So then I looked at the studies that some studies just captured attitude, and I found a smaller group that looked, why did people like them? And this matches all the research I've done. These are the same categories I came up with in my own research in different protected areas. Direct benefits, conservation of biodiversity and ecosystem services, right? And here's like the verbatim responses over on this side. You've got resource extraction. Of course, that's important, right? A lot of these are in contexts where they rely on fuel wood and fodder and things from those protected areas, even if it's illegal, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. They also recognize recreation and aesthetic benefits. People say, it's beautiful. The forest is beautiful. We like watching and seeing the wildlife, going for picnics, walking. Even if they're illegally walking, they'll still say we like going into the area. Climate, fresh air, trees, which of course, climate and fresh air intersect with ecosystem services, right? But that's the nature of categories. Cultural benefits in some of the areas. It's part of our tradition. Maybe there's a religious site inside of it. Maybe the protected area is a part of their cultural identity, right? So there's cultural things too. And then there's things that I call indirect benefits. So they recognize assistance from the protected management and community development programs that might be occurring in the buffer zone, or employment or income benefits. And I'm not going to talk too much about the problems today, but there's also all these problems, and we need to recognize there are problems, and that's why we need to do a better job managing protected areas, right, and recognizing it. But that's not what I'm going to focus on today, since we're talking about what motivates them to participate in conservation. So I was going to have you rank from your perspective, if you looked across these sets of direct and indirect benefits, what you thought would be the most common. So maybe if people just want to type in the messages again, just list which one you think was the most common benefit across all those cases, all those protected areas as a category. If you have any questions about them, you can also put that in there right now. Oh, Hillary says cultural benefits. Anyone else have a guess? It's okay. I mean, obviously, I'm just curious what everyone thinks. Tourism money. Someone says tourism. Cultural again. Resources, so extraction. Aesthetic benefits and employment. Recreation aesthetic, okay. Anyone else want to make a guess before I show you? Here's a summary across those cases. In how many of those cases did the community see these different categories of benefits? Number one, conservation of biodiversity and regulating services. In 81% of those areas, people mentioned this benefit. And if you want to read more about the details of the surveys, you need to read the paper. But this captures open-ended and closed-ended, right? So methodologically, there's a lot going on here. But across those protected areas, this was the most commonly mentioned, found direct benefit, 81%, right? And no one guessed I call it CES, Conservation Ecosystem Services. No one guessed it. So it's interesting, right? Our assumptions are kind of wrong about local communities and what they value about protected areas. After that is resource extraction. At less than half the cases, though, said this. Recreation aesthetic is 20%, so kind of surprisingly high, and only 7 have cultural. Do people say cultural? And of course, it kind of depends on definitions, but I showed you my categories. They're pretty clear categories. And this is pretty high too, the indirect, the protected area management and community development and employment and income. But I would also say that you have to remember too that in all these areas, a study was probably only done because there were a lot of projects going on, right? And so just to be clear that these are not really remote areas where nobody has worked, right? So that is going to have impacted there's perceptions and attitudes, and there's going to be a lot of projects that probably went on, but those are an important component. And I call them indirect just because the question is, what is your perception of a protected area? When I ask someone, do you like or dislike it? I'm thinking of the protected area itself, and management of the protected area is an indirect thing, right? That's a different entity. That's not the protected area. So that's why I take those out separately. So let's see, was there any question there? There's one. So assistance in maintaining their own values. Okay, and I'm not sure, maybe you can clarify that, but so yeah, and it shows that, I mean, they have the values. That's the basic point of this, right? People have they recognize conservation of the wildlife as a value that they value, right? They think that's a benefit, as are the ecosystem services. And then I wanted to quickly show you, because I just can't resist this, the difference between Africa and Asia, which are the only two countries where there are enough surveys to actually compare them. And there are some really interesting differences, which I think, like I kind of talked about, population, I think is one key thing, and the history of protected area, or history of protected area at a continental level. So resource extraction, way more common in Asia as a benefit, right? Probably because of density of populations. Sometimes the protected area is the only forest around. They got nowhere else to go besides that national park. Africa, they're much less dependent on them for resource extraction. For recreation and aesthetic benefits, way higher in Asia. Again, that's the only forest that might be nearby, right? With water and shade and cool breezes and a place to go enjoy yourself. Much different in Africa. Only 6%. Let's see. Employment and income benefits. Way more important in Africa, which is interesting, right? I have no idea. So this is just an area really interesting to study more. And if we had enough cases for Latin America, that would be really interesting too. Not nearly as important in Asia because there's so many people. So fewer people relatively get those kinds of benefits from a protected area project. Who knows? I'm not sure. And there's some differences with the negative attributes too, which match. So in Asia, the lack of extraction and use is much more of a problem. And then land loss and no agricultural expansion is mentioned much more in Africa too, which I'm not quite sure why. So anyone have any theories, let me know, or want to work on this kind of stuff, let me know. Okay, then I just wanted to give you a quick particular area, Bardia National Park, and this is from my own dissertation. I could have chosen something more recent, but this is from my own dissertation research, just because I have this nice list here of like every verbatim response that people gave me, and this is comparing 3 different protected areas in Nepal. And you can just kind of see like how many, just different things people, here we have one person saying temple, actually 12 people here saying temple conservation, because there was a temple in Kakri Vihar. Here's your conservation ecosystem services, conserve forest, improve climate. Rain and water is huge. Rain and water all of our sites almost ends up being a really important thing. Like in Peru, one of the main motivators for the communities there is the water issues. And it's just, the diversity of what people are thinking is pretty amazing if you ask them in an open-ended way. Here's the extraction. You can kind of get the variety of extraction that people are doing. So yeah, just interesting things, I think, when you go talk to people about what they think. Any questions about attitudes and motivations for conservation? So it's mainly just to show that I will say, and our founder will say, we've never walked into a village where we didn't have people who are interested in talking about biodiversity and interested in talking about conservation and how their resources have changed over time and how species, right? There's just people are interested in this stuff and they want to talk about it. So at least at that level, it's an easy entry into most communities if you go in with like an open attitude and want to learn what they're thinking anyway.
There was one in the chat from Anne about how about contrasts in forest versus savanna conservation? Is that something you can speak to?
And I think that probably gets at some of that Africa stuff, right? Africa versus Asia, but we'd have to include the ecosystem, right? Or the landscape in the in the analysis. So that's why I said, if anyone wants to think about those things, let me know. It'd be interesting to look at exactly what's happening there. Anything else about that? Okay, but I'm not trying to say that everyone is totally pro-conservation and they're going to drop everything and join a conservation group, right? And that there aren't problems. That's not what I'm saying at all. So it's really important to think about what is a community, right? And I think a critical concept that gets lost in the language, but should be obvious to us all, is that a community, people don't all have the same attitudes and perceptions in a community or even within a household, right? So even in your own household, right? You don't all agree, mom, dad, kids, you have different opinions about, well, which is your favorite park, or why do you like that park? Why do you want to go there? Or how should we conserve the environment? Or, what should our tax? I mean, no one agrees on everything, right? And that's true in the community too. And just as an example, in that protected area attitude summary paper that I was using for the example here, in terms of the methods, I also looked at methods to really understand how people are looking at park people relationships and attitudes. And so in 43% of the papers, they sampled individuals, right? So only in those papers are you actually looking at people's perceptions of protected areas, right? The whole community perceptions. 38% sampled the household at the household level, right? And they usually then interviewed the household head or whoever was available. So this is going to mean that basically then you're just asking usually middle-aged men what they think about the protected area, right? So there's a lot of bias built into these surveys when you look at what the methods actually were. And then 19 didn't even specify how they sampled, right? So you're looking at community perceptions, but we don't even know who you interviewed and how you sampled. So it's really, really important just to think about, well, what's a community? How does a community think about something? What is that? Make sure, if you're actually in a community yourself, try and talk to different people, get a variety of perspectives. If a community leader tells you, oh, the community feels this way, or the community feels that way, don't always believe them, right? Because they don't know either. Have they done a survey? Have they gone out and talked to every person in the community, every woman, every marginalized person? So it's just good to keep in mind, right, that there's a lot of diversity even at a household level that we don't often capture. The next thing I want to talk about is, what are the predictors then? So if we understood why people have these positive attitudes, like which ones have these positive attitudes? What predicts that they're going to be positive? And that's a lot of what I was looking at too in my research. And a lot of what we do in these predictor papers is we look at socioeconomic variables, right? We're trying to say, well, it's women. How do women feel versus men? Or how, the higher the income, the more positive you are, or the higher status the profession means more education or more money, right? You're going to have a better attitude. So we're always trying to do those socioeconomic sort of links and associations. And just to give you a couple examples how those are not really the best indicators of people's attitudes if we actually look through what predicts it. So for example, in Myanmar, looking at women and men's differences in attitudes, I found the women were much less likely to like protected areas. But that was because they didn't know as much about conservation ecosystem service benefits, right? It was not because they were women per se. We could find that, the reason is because they knew less about those protected areas. They didn't see these benefits. And to carry that one step further in Nepal, we looked at how much protected area knowledge they have. And it was actually, so the women were equally likely in Nepal to like the protected area. And I think that's because Nepal is so proactive. They have so much going on. People understand the value of protected areas. They like them. But women are less likely to say the conservation ecosystem service benefits. And that was because they have less protected area knowledge. We had questions asking them, when was the area created? Who manages it? Why was it created? And they just didn't know as much about the protected areas. So the takeaway in terms of this, for example, is that, well, if women perceive these things, they'd probably be twice as likely in Nepal to like the area. But the takeaway is that women are not usually invited to meetings in a lot of these contexts, right? They don't have access to the information. They don't know what's going on with a protected area. When there's a community meeting, there's often, they're not invited. They may have a lack of time because they have more responsibilities in the household or the fields or cultural constraints. So in Myanmar, when I was first working with them, and I said, look, I know in Nepal, if you invite the women, it's really important. You'll have much better outcomes. And they were like, that's not what we do here. Culturally, the women do not come. And I was like, because I'd seen it work in Nepal, I'm like, no, we really have to. We just have to invite them. Maybe they won't come, but we need to start to change that dynamic and invite the women. It's just really important. Or marginalized people, right? So we're going to expect similar patterns for marginalized groups. So it's really important to think about who has access to information and how is that informing their attitude. So just to summarize that, because I'm introducing a lot here pretty quickly, but it's less about the socioeconomic variables and it's more about, why is being a woman causing you to have a different attitude, right? So for example, gender doesn't explain attitudes. It's because they have less access to information, right? It's not because they're a woman or it's not because they're poor necessarily. So just to keep that in mind. So overall, in all the studies, the main lessons are the best predictor of a positive attitude across all these studies is a perception of conservation ecosystem service benefits. If someone knows and thinks these are benefits of a protected area, they're more likely to like it. And if they have knowledge about conservation or the protected area, then they're more likely to see those types of benefits. So it's just, again, saying the same thing. Knowledge and information is really important. One more example, and this comes from Chitwan National Park, and it's a little bit different because this was with a colleague, Neil Carter, who was looking at attitudes towards tigers, and we broke it down by gender. And what we found here is that everyone is positive towards tiger in terms of their attitude, right? But there is a difference. Women are a little bit less positive. So you've got 83% of men saying it pleases them just to have tigers in the forest, and only 71% of women. And just to say also, this is true of protected areas too. When I say women are more negative in Nepal and Myanmar, they're not that much more negative than men, right? The still majorities are usually positive. So it's not like they're super negative. They're just less, less positive than men. Do you enjoy having tigers in your area? 83% of men, 64% of women. And we put these together and summarized that people's attitude toward tiger. And then we looked at what explained the difference between men and women. And what we found was 66% of the difference between men and women in their attitudes, whether they liked or disliked tiger, was because of their beliefs about tiger. It wasn't their socioeconomic characteristics. That explained about 12%. It wasn't their experience with tiger. It wasn't their perceptions of risk of the tiger that explained their attitude. And it wasn't their feelings of control in terms of, did they know what to do if they saw a tiger in the wild, or, did they feel like they had tools to protect themselves? It was their beliefs about the tiger. And if we look at the specific beliefs they were asked about, the main belief that explained most of the difference in attitude, 31% of the difference, was explained by women not thinking that tigers help keep forests healthy, right? Which is like an ecological ecosystem service kind of a thing, right? So again, it sort of matches all the other studies where women just don't have access to thinking about conservation ecosystem services. They just don't think of tigers. So, and then there's, everything else, part of a culture, right to live, nuisance, not enough room. The beliefs play a role in explaining that, but mainly it's just keeping the forest healthy, the conservation ecosystem service benefits. So I think that's really interesting. And the last thing I want to say about attitudes, and that is thinking about how attitudes change over time. And there's not too many studies that really look at this, but in Chaten Wildlife Sanctuary, we were able to look at changes just in the 4 years when we did the initial survey. And the warden did a whole bunch of changes in his management. Like he allowed people to go from this side of the protected area on this road. He allowed them to enter rather than having to go around. He tried to build trust, and say, hey, I understand that these are difficult issues. If I let you have access, please do not extract. Don't do illegal things. Maybe you can take some mushrooms, right? So he really worked to improve his relationship with them and address the conflicts that they perceived. And what we saw after 4 years is that women's positive attitudes increased from 44% saying they liked the area to 55%. And we went from 43% of men to 54%. So their attitudes improved about the same, from less than to more than a majority, but they changed in different ways. So when we looked at what they actually believed, women's perceptions primarily improved through an increase of their positive perceptions. They were more likely, after that 4 years of being involved and being included, to talk about conservation ecosystem service benefits from the protected area. And the men's primarily increased through a decrease in their negative perceptions. So those positive things that the warden had done to, try and mitigate the problems with extraction and the traveling through on the road and things like that. That's what improved the men's attitude. So the important thing to think about here is that, again, communities and different groups will have different perceptions and attitudes and will change in different ways depending on where they started from. And that's just important to keep in mind as we work with communities. So to end this section, I just want to say, we tend to undervalue local conservation values. We underestimate the diversity of values in a community. We underestimate that values change through time, and that the information and access to information is a key part of their values and how they think about like protected areas or biodiversity. Okay. And that is the end of that section. If anyone has questions, there's a couple comments here.
Yeah, and one of those was a question that Gwen had saying in Honduras, they had very successful women's cooperatives, but the women met independently from men, and that mixed gender meetings were difficult for women leadership. Did you find the same in Nepal or in other areas?
Yes, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of different ways to approach the gender issues, and I'm not sure there's a whole lot of good stuff out there that summarizes it at a larger scale, right? So if you're actually going in to do a project, and we all have like different things happening at each of our sites, but I'm not sure. I've looked for a long time trying to get a clear picture of like what are the recommendations, like in Nepal with those community forestry groups where the women they've had so much success including women, but there's not much summarizing kind of across a large a large number of cases. What was it? Was it better to separate women? Was it better to, I mean, I think both, what happens is both have to end up happening, right? Because when you separate women, it also kind of separates the issue. Often there are projects where then, well, this is the women's stuff and this is the men's stuff, right? So it's a matter of like separating and bringing back together as a community, right? Because it's community conservation. The community has to be governing it. So how do we get women involved in working with the men, right? And it's Nepal is another good case study for that because they've really seen it happen at the national level where trying all these different ways of involving women has really meant that you can capture at a national level that women are way more involved in politics. So they've actually traced how many women went from community forest user groups to elections in local politics or, whatever scale of politics in Nepal. And I think that's been pretty interesting to see. But I don't know of any great summaries of the best way to do it because I think the context can be so specific for that. Were there any other things, Stephanie, you think I should address in there?
I think the rest were just comments of Gwen followed up though and said that connection from conservation to larger national political action is fascinating.
Yeah.
And then Heather had a comment, even studies in the US have shown that US farmers aren't motivated by payment-based rewards to steward the ecosystem services of their land. Instead, they related more with the benefits of passing land down to their children. So payment-based motivators aren't as strong as previously thought.
Oh, that's awesome. Heather, if you can share those studies with me, that would be great. I would love to see that because I think, yeah, that really matches, right? And it's hard in North America because we do approach these issues so differently, right? So finding the papers that show the same patterns can be difficult sometimes, but I would love to see that. Okay, again, feel free to write anything in there as we move on to process, which is the final main section we're going to cover today. And this first, I'm going to introduce you to how we as community conservation as an organization view the process, how we summarize our experiences over the last few decades. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is participation. I'm going to talk about approaching a community, like the process of working with a community has a lot to do with how we approach them and how we're thinking about them. Are they glass half full or half empty, right? Are we solving problems or are we finding solutions with a community, right? There's different ways to approach that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, choosing activities. What do we actually do with communities? How can we think about that step in the process? So the first thing, and this is a pretty heuristic type of way of thinking about community conservation that our founder actually put together in papers that you can find on our website. Here it is, the Rob Horwich et al. There's a couple papers that you're welcome to take a look at. But if we summarize it, basically there's an initial discussion with community leaders, right? You enter a community, you introduce yourself, you're talking initially with leaders, the gatekeepers, you're trying to learn about the community, introduce yourself, find out where they are, what are they thinking? Do they want to try and work with you? And there's different ways to do that we'll talk about. You're informally building a relationship, right? Having conversations now, not just with leaders, but with other people, trying to learn more about the community. Often the next step is some form of, trainings or workshops, participatory education, trying to reach out, share information like I've been talking about so much. And then from those initial steps, local leaders, local conservation leaders often emerge. Like initially, maybe the local leaders vaguely interested more in, well, how can you help me? What can you do for my community? Maybe they're really interested in conservation, but as you continue to work with the community, people do rise up and become more, they'll express interest. They'll get excited about what you're doing. And then they become the leaders, right? And they help with the trainings and workshops, and they help gather the support and have the conversations with the community. And then usually at this point, you've got some amount of momentum and the community is interested and they want to move forward. Then you're trying to create some formal program or plans, such as a new sanctuary, a new protected area like a community forest or a concession. And you're getting that going with a set of activities with the community. You're co-creating that. And then what we saw at that point is that word begins to spread. Even if you just work with one community, like the Community Baboon Sanctuary in Belize, you work with one community and the neighboring communities say, hey, That's really interesting. We would like to participate. And then you see the interest in launching similar projects spreads horizontally from one village to the other, right? They start learning from each other. And our partner in Peru has actually captured this at the national level, looking at how different community conserved areas sort of spread across the landscape in this way. And then also it often goes vertically. So then if you have a successful project that's conserving biodiversity and doing a good job, you get government, other NGOs, other groups that become interested in supporting that. And that's certainly in Nepal at a national level. You can see it with community forestry. When the first model of community forestry at a local level started coming out in the 70s, you had all the donors jumping onto that model. So this is maybe an extreme example of the vertical. But the story in Nepal is that it really took that vertical support to spread. Like the communities wanted to do it, but it wasn't going to spread without vertical support, really getting the government to make it policy and to support it at a larger scale. And so this is kind of the way that we've seen the process work in the projects we've done around the world. So then just to talk about, participation as a process. What does it mean to have people participating, right? Who's participating? Why are they participating? And I'd like to introduce this just because it itself is sort of the way you want to move through a project to some extent, right? So, and maybe some of you have seen this typology of participation. There's a ton of them out there. This is one of the first, the Pimbert and Pretty, that gets cited a lot. And you start out, and a lot of this comes from development work too, right? Like how we do development work around the world and how people were included in development. And there's passive participation. You go from passive, where people are just told, this is the project, this is what we're going to do. Here's a protected area, it's going to get made, right? Just be aware. To participation in information giving. Maybe there's some consultations. You ask a community like, well, what do you think about it? Well, it's still going to happen, but we're interested in hearing what you think. Or consultation. And here's one that kind of stands out, participation for material incentives. So this gets back to, this is not really the direction we want to move into necessarily, but this is like in development, you end up paying people to be involved. Like community forestry, you often will pay people to have a plantation, right? Or to build the nursery or to do the different activities that need to get done to make the project happen. Functional participation, where maybe people participate by forming groups, but they're to meet objectives that the project has set externally, right? And then you start moving into interactive participation, where the people are actually participating in joint analysis, helping to write the action plans, right? Maybe like a co-management, a collaborative process. Or maybe the ultimate is the self-mobilization, and people participate by doing it themselves, totally independently of any projects or external funding or people, right? So you can kind of just think about, and it's not that actually any one of these is right or wrong, which I think is really interesting too. And you can see how in the process, when I talked about a community conservation process, you're kind of moving through these stages ideally. To some extent, it kind of mirrors those stages I was talking about. And you're trying to get down to here, right? You're trying to make sure people have the resources and the capacity to be down at this level. And often they're already there in some of our projects. In other cases, you've got to work through more of these stages. Here's just another, maybe your brain thinks a little bit differently. So here's just another example of the spectrum of participation: inform, consult, involve, collaborate, defer to. And again, I've talked a lot about information, right? So inform is very important, but that's, again, not where we need to stop, right? We got to push through these different levels and get to the democratic participation, right? Like community forests in Nepal, where they really contributed to at the high level to governance and elections and all that. So that's just to introduce you to participation a little bit. So you can think about, as you're doing different activities, who's participating, why, what's the point of this, what are we doing? And then I want to talk about approach, which is really key. And this is the glass half empty or half full when we approach? And we could do many hours on this topic. I don't know, has any of you heard of appreciative inquiry as an approach to development? And there's a lot. I encourage you all to go, if you're interested in this, go look it up. There's a whole bunch of this stuff that you can design entire, projects around appreciative inquiry. So instead of doing traditional like development or project planning where you're identifying a problem, like often in conservation planning, we're like, well, what's the problem? Tigers are getting lost. What's causing it, right? This is the threats. What are the threats? What are the possible solutions? what's our action or activity? And, there's a problem we need to solve. But working with communities, development, there's a lot of stuff out there that shows working with communities, this is not the best way to do it. What happens in Nepal, for example, is this is the approach to development in Nepal, one of the biggest donor country, so many donors in Nepal giving so much money over so many years. And you literally would go out in the village and people are like, we are poor, we are backwards, give us the project. What money are you bringing, right? And that's because this was the approach to development. But with this approach, you're going into a community, you're building on their assets, their strengths, finding out what they want, right? Working with them in a glass half full approach, that what have they already achieved? How can we help them achieve what their goals are? And I don't really have time to get into it all today, but it's just thinking about when we approach a community, it's good to go in a positive way, right? We are wired for negativity, right? There's just a lot here where we are predisposed to want to fix things. It's just human nature. But it's not necessarily the way that gets us the answers we need to solve what we think of as a problem, right? So the questions you ask determine the answers you get, right? So negative questions generate negative responses. So some other things to think about are like placebo studies, right? So if people believe that a placebo is going to help them, it does, right? If you walk in thinking positively, more positive things come out than a negative attitude. Or positive deviance in terms of research is really interesting. Thinking about how, like, here's an example here is if you have all these malnourished children, for example, should you keep studying every child who's malnourished and figure out why they're malnourished? Or what happens if you look at the positive deviance? What about the kids in the community who are not malnourished, but have the similar families, right? So what causes them to come out being more resilient or better fed, right? What are the strategies they use? So positive deviance is a really powerful way to approach coming up with solutions. And here's a really long study that I need to try and summarize. I just found this recently, which is where positive deviance first and this appreciative inquiry approach first came from and Save the Children in 1990. And it turns out they were looking at malnutrition. And what they found was that the children and families who were not malnourished, the poor family, the parents were collecting tiny shrimps or crabs or snails, like something you would never even notice mainly, from the rice paddies and adding these to their child's diet, right, along with the regular diet. And conventional wisdom in the community said you shouldn't feed those things to children, apparently. But they took those positive examples and shared it amongst the families. And all of a sudden, from the original 4 communities, the practice has spread to 10 adjacent communities and then across the whole country. So there we have that whole spread, right? A village does something really interesting, something really positive, it gets passed along and spread around. So really powerful examples of like positive deviance and an appreciative inquiry approach. Like what is already going on well in this community? What can we build on? And there's a lot there to unpack, but just want to give you that to think about. And the example I have from my own work with doing work with our projects was a gibbon team in Myanmar that I worked with, and they were working with gibbons up in the northeast of Myanmar, and they'd been doing a lot of research and working with the local communities. And I had said to them at one point as we were doing some conservation planning, well, what's a positive, instead of thinking about the problem and the gibbons are decreasing and the communities are negative and they're doing the poaching, can you think of anything positive happening in those communities? And they just looked at me blankly for the longest time. And then one of them actually said something about, well, actually one of the leaders was really, he stopped poaching of the gibbon in his community. It took him a long time to think of this example. I'm like, that's it. There's your positive, your glass half full. You have a community leader who's already done something to help protect the gibbons in his community. Work with him, build with him, come up with activities, figure out why did he do that? How can you help spread that to the other villages? So sometimes these positive things are right in front of us, but we're so focused on our threats-based planning and figuring out a solution that we don't see the solutions that are already in front of us. So again, appreciative inquiry, looking at, assets, asset-based development is just another way, if any of you are familiar with thinking about assets. What are the assets in a community? What can we already build on? What have they already achieved? What are they already doing that's a good thing? And there's so many different types of assets, right? Human, social, political, financial, cultural, built. They're natural. They're, biodiversity. So using a positive approach and thinking about what we can build on is a really, really, really important core piece to doing community conservation. And if I'm doing the workshop where we have time to actually do activities and interact a little bit, at this point, I usually have people write their own introduction, right? So let's say you have a project you want to do, you're going to walk into a community. I have them write an introduction and then get up and give it to the class or do it virtually. We all get to listen to their introduction and how they introduce themselves. So, we're going through the process here, right? Initial discussions with community leaders, how you present yourself, the approach you take, the way you do it really matters. And I just wanted to play this video from Sam Shani, who is the program projects director in Peru, talking about how when they first started working on their projects about 20 years ago, the different approaches and the lessons they learned in terms of how they introduced themselves to communities.
But what we discovered when we came out here, the first community we visited, we had the intention of going there because that was a site that we thought would be good for conservation. And of course we found support in the community for conservation. But as we were the ones who arrived there and proposed the conservation project, it's since then been viewed by the community to a certain extent that they're helping us with the project that we wanted to do. What we found with our approach in other communities, by accident, but is that we invited them to meetings, we explained our approach to work, and then they have asked us for our help. So therefore, right from the start in those projects, it's us helping them do their own conservation work. And it really changes the dynamic where the people even more feel ownership. They don't feel that you owe them anything for the help that they're receiving. And it's helped those community projects advance a lot quicker and more successfully in some cases. I'll give an example. The second community we went to, they'd heard that we were working in La Esperanza, which is a neighbouring community a few villages over, and they invited us because they were already conserving their forests. And they said, we have a reserve, and when we looked for it in the government paperwork, in the database, and it didn't exist. And they said, no, we're protecting it. But they didn't have, the legal registration. They didn't have any standing in that sense. We offered them our help to help them get the legal registration for the reserve. And then after that, they again took over managing it. It didn't change much on the ground because they were already protecting the forest, but it gives them extra legal standing. In that first community that we work with, it's still fairly dependent that every now and then they'll call us and they'll say, we need some help with patrols or we need some help with this, but with the other communities it's much less.
Yeah, I think that's just a great story, right? Of thinking about how we approach communities and how much, like I've said, communities are doing already so much on the ground, right? So a huge piece of community conservation is us sort of recognizing even what they're already doing, right? And not coming in with our own assumptions about what's happening and then supporting them to do it. So here would be I was just going to show you the introduction. I had people write, they start like, my name is, I am from, I am here because, and then trying to get them to think about one positive thing to say to the community, because I've done the workshop before where people stand up and say, and you're poaching the birds and we need to stop that, right? So getting them really to think about, it seems deceptively, it's deceptively hard, right? You think this would be easier than it is, but it's actually quite hard to think of what the first things you're going to say to a community when you walk in and actually start talking to them, especially if you're a single person, a student, a researcher, the NGO doesn't have a presence there yet or anything. And so, okay, so we're sort of moving through this process. And then, I want to talk just a little bit about, again, the emergence of local conservation leaders. And what happens in every community we work, there are always these people that come to the fore and just actually recognize and show you some photos of I'm sure you've all met people too in the communities and places you've worked. Shankar Luitel, who just really wants to protect elephants out in eastern Nepal. This is Juana from Peru, who's trying to protect one of the community concessions, and she just spearheaded trying to get people involved, because at the beginning they really didn't even understand, what do you mean we can have a concession? What do we have to do, right? And she's just someone who took up the challenge because she thought this is really important. Or Lakshmi, one thing I've seen in our community heroes, this is Lakshmi from Nepal, who a lot of these heroes are just interested in making their communities better places, right? Some of them specifically are biodiversity, right? But most of them are doing a whole bunch of things. They're just interested in making their communities better places, just like in our own communities, we have people who are like that, right? They want better health and better quality of life for everyone in their community. And then here's the forest leader from Baca that we saw earlier. So they're real people just like us in the ground and all these communities who want the same things we do, who we can help support. So I'm actually coming to the end here. The one thing, so in this kind of introduction, I'm not really talking a whole lot about the actual activities that you can design, but if I was going to do part two and we actually start thinking about individual projects and what you can do, one exercise I have people do is really think about the activities that you can do with the community, because often in conservation planning, the activities themselves are kind of a black box. And these are the categories I use when I look at any conservation program. This helped me even doing evaluations for USAID, because there'll be 1,000 activities that a big project is doing, right? And you need to categorize and think, what are they doing? And I think, and I would love your feedback if you can see a category that's missing here. But basically, to do a conservation project, you need knowledge about the target and what you want to conserve. You do need to know what the threats are. You do need to understand what's driving that. So you need basic knowledge of the species and how many individuals there are or what's threatening them. But then you also need the awareness and advocacy activities, right? People have to know the species exists. And this isn't just in communities. You can think of this at any national level or wherever. You need people aware of the issue of whatever it is that you're trying to protect. You need people beginning to advocate, the constituencies, right? So they need the awareness. Then people need capacity. Does the capacity exist to conserve that target, right? So if it's elephants in Nepal, what capacity? What do people need to know about elephants? What things do they need to be able to monitor or to do or governance? Do they have the capacity to vote democratically? Do they know how to use a checkbook for the CFUG? I mean, with the community forest user groups in Nepal, even getting people to understand how auditing worked and financial responsibilities, that's capacity too, right? And then policy and planning is, of course, key. In some cases, you don't have any policies that help you, like community forestry. But, whatever, or, in where there is no community forestry or no policies like that, right? But make sure you really know what are the policies, what could help us here, or what's actually not helping us here at the policy level. And the final thing is the actual direct action. You actually need something that puts a governance and management system in place where you actually have, and this gets to Eleanor Ostrom's work, right? In the Commons, you need to be monitoring and enforcing some set of rules that are community driven if they're community conservation, right? With the community actually enforcing them in the place. So those are like the key components. And any project, you can begin to look through. I have people think about the sites they're going to go work at and say, what do you already know about the site in terms of these? Where are the holes in your own knowledge? Like maybe this village, this community you want to work in has a bunch of capacity because they've had a whole bunch of other development projects there that have worked on capacity for some other thing, like a health post, or you know what I mean? There's what has gone on in that community. Where can you fill in this table before you even start a project? And then just keep revisiting it and thinking about, well, geez, no one has any awareness the species even exists. We really need to work on that, right? So, and then to me, there's a theory of change in these activities, right? If you have capacity, the knowledge generation, awareness, and advocacy, those are like the supporting or enabling strategic approaches that you need in order to manage a habitat or species, right? To actually conserve it. And the policies and planning, if they're there, they will be one of the main levers that actually help you do this management, like community forestry in Nepal. So that sort of gets us through this, how we make plans. How do we think of the activities we can do with a community group? And then just to touch quickly on those last 2 points where you've got contagion going horizontally we have talked about it a bit, so I probably don't need to say too much. But some of the ways that people have done the horizontal contagion in our projects is annual celebrations. And a lot of projects do these, right? Like, an annual owl event every year, right? So different annual celebrations that really highlight a species or a project, and you bring in people from neighboring villages to learn what happened and have a party and hear what was happening. In Nepal, you have a FACO fund for community forest user groups, which ended up becoming, it sort of was an NGO that became the representative body for all the community forest user groups outside of the government. So then this organization would lobby for all the community forest user groups with the government, did the advocacy for them, and really helped to spread things horizontally. In Manas, we saw it spread through this network of village forest protection forces. So just the villages sharing with each other. Okay, and then the vertical, an example of how you can help develop the vertical is that in Myanmar, our main partner, every time he started a project anywhere, he would invite everybody, every government official, every office, he would every NGO to come to some initial meetings because he knew that those people could either be the obstacle to that project or they could really help support it. And you never knew when that might be, like when they might throw up a blockade or when they might support you. So he was really good about never working in isolation, always trying to include everybody he could at a site, from government and like I said, NGOs, from any CSOs, anyone he thought that could help. Um, and just to say, indicators of success, this is all about biodiversity conservation, right? Species or habitat improvement is the outcome that we want. That's the target we're going for. And just to summarize, this is all a process, right? It takes time and adaptation. Time is critical in working with communities. None of this happens fast. 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. No one process is right. Every NGO is different. Every person is different. The skills you bring to a community when you're trying to work with them. And one thing I try to always say is, like, often with projects too, we don't have that much time. We want to do a community project. We don't have 20 years. Maybe only 1 year, 5 years of funding. But what can you do to leave as much as you can behind? And I think this table can also help you think through that. Like, what activities can I do that actually leave behind awareness, knowledge, capacity, right, with that community? Even if I have to leave in a year, have I transferred as much as I can to the community of what I have access to that could help them? And that's, I think, the end of what I wanted to say. And didn't leave quite as much time for questions as I wanted, but happy to take any that there are.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Terry. We have just a couple minutes left for questions. I know that you answered a lot along the way, but if anyone has any questions that they have not had a chance to ask yet, now is the time. You can go ahead and unmute yourselves, or you can pop them in the chat, whatever makes you most comfortable.
And everyone can feel free to contact me later if you have other questions or interested in doing part 2. Let me know if anyone wants to develop projects or at a point. I was going to mention, so in Bangladesh, yeah, we have a woman working with elephants. She just went out and did some workshops last week, and so she's day to day using these tools of the table and the theory of change, and doing her project.
Awesome. There's a lot of thank yous and broadly applicable, deeply appreciative. So thank you so much, Terry.
You're welcome. Thank you guys for giving me the chance. I really enjoyed it.
Any questions before I share our closing slide?
Oh, and I will stop sharing.
There's a question in the chat of how can we rewatch this? And Bernie, we're going to be sharing the recording, right? I'll turn that
We
to you.
are, correct.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll be sharing the recording on our YouTube page and also upload it to our website.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bernie. And I just want to close real quick with the slides you guys kind of got a peek of earlier, which is to please take our post-event survey. I popped the QR code up here. We're looking to continue doing these sorts of workshop series, and so we'd love to get your feedback on how you like this format, if this time and everything works well for you, what you'd like to see in the future. So if you could please scan the QR code and take the survey to give us your feedback, we would greatly appreciate it. And we'll put that link in the chat as well. All right, I'm going to stop my share so we can all see our faces again. And once again, thank you all so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. And Terry, thank you so much for sharing with all of us. That was really wonderful. We greatly appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.